Hi everyone, and welcome in. Probably about right now you're thinking, great, we're going to make a space marine. Not really. I actually painted this guy about 2 years ago. It was one of those have a fun Saturday sort of project for me. And since then, it's sat on my shelf and it catches my eye all the time. It's probably because it's blue. It's really, I think, the only blue model I have on my shelf. But then the other day I was looking at it and got to thinking, I really didn't spend very much time on its base. And I think as long as I'm going to keep looking at this model, I'm going to put him on something that's a little bit, fancier. So let's build. For those of you who are familiar with Warhammer and Space Marines, I'm sure you're looking at my guy and going like, that is not how they're supposed to look. And yeah, I totally agree with you, and especially looking at these pictures right now. My guy doesn't look anything like these guys. But that's not the point. The point here is, I like my guy, and I want to give him a little bit better base to stand on. So, here we get going. I'm going to use this as my inspiration for this little base. This is Coffin Rocks, and then the Oregon Cascades near Mount Jefferson, not too far away from where I live. Well, to get things started, I'm just going to tear up little pieces of this carving foam, and these will all just be smaller rocks and debris that will be setting on the base. No need to stress about the size or the shape at this point. It's all going to be useful. This particular foam is a little on the thicker side, a little thicker than I want. So I'm just going to kind of roughly cut it in half using my hobby knife. And that rough texture, in this case, I really want that because that's going to add a lot of realism to these rock faces. Basic shapes, and then just glue it down to the base with some PVA glue. This is probably a good time to mention this. When you're working with foams and glues, they have a tendency to react to one another, and that is oftentimes glue will melt or dissolve the foam. This is particularly true when using CA glues or super glues. So it's always going to be a good idea for a test before you start working on your own project, and one reason why PVA or white glue is generally a pretty safe choice. And now that I've got the basic form in place with all the foam, I just need to fill in all these gaps, and for that I'm just going to use the Magic Sculpt. I just think that this type of a putty is just perfect for these kinds of situations. Super easy to work with, fills in the gaps perfectly. You can sculpt into it, you could add texture. It's really nothing better. Once I had all the gaps filled, then I turned to the AK acrylic textures. I began with concrete, but then I found that it was just a little bit too gritty, so then I went back over it with AK's Asphalt, and that's a little finer texture and it was a little closer to what I was looking for the surfaces of the rock. As it turns out, using the Asphalt was really actually pretty beneficial. That dark black just gives me some really nice deep shadows, and onto that I can just airbrush a little bit of color and get ready to do some paintbrush work. Okay, so let's get ready to paint. Just setting up the wet palette here with some different shades of grays and light browns. And then I also noticed in that reference photograph that there was a reddish tone that kind of ran through the rocks, like maybe some iron oxide or something like that. And that really caught my eye, so I thought that would be a nice addition too. So I'm using that cork color to add that into the palette. This part of the painting is super easy, super chill, very relaxing. The hard work was done earlier on, and it wasn't really that hard. Just adding that really dark asphalt color gave us really deep, rich shadows. And then airbrushing on, especially that deck tan, gave us some really nice bright highlights. So now all that's needed is just add these really thinned out washes and change the tones of the rocks and add just some visual interest. Just building up some color layers slowly but surely. I'm enjoying this cork color, that's really nice. Adds a little bit of warmth to it. And painting bases is exactly the same as painting your models. Kind of start with broad strokes and the washes, the overall base color, and then come back in and start refining the details. So now I've changed brushes to something a little bit smaller, and notice how the paint is thicker. It's got more opacity to it. So I can just go ahead and pick out all the edging and highlights and start making these rocks really pop out. And of course, that tried and true favorite trick of just picking out all the little surface details just to give little highlights. And even though these are rocks, and pardon the pun, it's still pretty rough. You can still see the individual brush strokes. It's not a lot of blending or unification that I've done with any of the paints. I'll have to take care of that here in the next step, and I think there's an easy way to do that. I think the simplest way to unify this surface is just to give it a nice dark brown wash. And so I've got some thinner that I kind of float over the surface, and then I add the wash to it, and just allow it to flow into the cracks and recesses, and it'll kind of tone down some of those stark transitions, especially where I've added those really bright highlights and sharp brush strokes, just kind of even things out a little bit. And I really debated this step. I didn't know if I wanted to do this or not, but in the end, I just felt like I needed a little bit more, I don't know, color or personality to this little base. And so I'm just adding just a little bit of the dark slime green color into some of the darker recesses and cracks and nooks and crannies. It's just going to give a little bit of subtle color to this base, and I think just make it pop just a little bit more, make it a little bit more interesting. And then finally, before I get finished with this, I just want to kind of clean up the edges a bit. So I just got some black paint here from the craft store, and just painting on around the edges and underneath the rocks, just so everything looks really nice and pretty. And there we have it, a new little base for our Space Marine.
Yes, sir!
And so all that's left to do now is to move our Space Marine from his old base onto the new base. And this isn't quite as simple as I was hoping it would be. I really glued him onto that old base. So this is taking a little bit more force and, frankly, breaking things than I thought or hoped it was going to. Uh-oh. We seem to have lost a foot here.
Ow!
There we go. A little Dr. Lawler to surgery here. Figured out why it was so attached to these little nubs on the bottom. I had sunk them into, guess what, Magic Sculpt, and so it certainly held them in place. So I'm just going to nip those off because I don't want to have to put those into my foam base. And then, nice thing about these Warhammers is that they're snap fit, so his foot just snapped back onto place. And then I just put him onto the base, and now I think we're ready to go. This truly was just a one-day build. Not a very complicated project, but it was a lot of fun to do. And more importantly, you know, my little Space Marine has a new platform to stand on. I hope you got something out of it that you can use on your own modeling. And please, hit that like and subscribe button. See you next time, and keep on modeling. Thanks.